Thank you. I'm Nicky. I'm a research fellow at the University of Aberdeen. I started working with stinkwort now 11 years ago as a grad student because I wanted to study a plant that was good at spreading, which worked. I then moved to California to work with Ingrid and Miranda on the invasion there. And I have since moved to Scotland, but I'm still really happy to continue working with them. And this has been such an exciting day for me as well. So thank you all so much for coming. So yeah, here I am here to tell you a bit about insights from stinkwort's native range and how those might be applying to California. Uh-oh, hang on. Nope. There, okay. So the native range of stinkwort is basically this green area you see here all around the Mediterranean basin. What you also see right away on this map is that it has this quite spectacular recent expansion of the native range as well, which I will be talking a bit about today. And you can also see on this map, as we've talked about in Ingrid's first talk, that there have been invasions in Australia, South Africa, and most recently also Chile. So basically everywhere else that has a Mediterranean climate in the world. So where does stinkwort grow in its native range? This will be a very familiar list of habitats to you. So disturbed areas, stony riverbanks. So quite interesting to hear you all talking about riparian habitats. Abandoned fields, roadsides, a lot of roadsides, industrial lots, and so on. And so this native range expansion I was talking about started in around the 1950s, but it's especially been really rapid since the 1990s. And roadsides were really important corridors for this spread in Europe as well. And similar to in California, plants in the Mediterranean area have this really late flowering phenology. So they flower October, they can make seeds up to December. So what I was really interested in studying as a grad student was what was happening with this flowering time as the plants were moving north, because we expected them to be constrained by the end of the growing season. So if you have a frost, basically all the plants die. Sadly, there's not a lot of frost in California, but yeah, I wanted to see what happens if plants spread north. And what we found, quite surprisingly, was that there was actually rapid evolution of flowering time during this native range expansion. So we sample plants here, as you see on this map, from southern France, from around this sort of original range limit in central France, and then in Switzerland and in the Netherlands. And then we grew all the plants together at the range limit in the north. And what you see on this diagram here on the left is basically when the plants were flowering. So flower early on the left and flower late on the right. And as you sort of move with this range expansion, you see the flowering time is shifting earlier and earlier and earlier. And this is really important for these plants because you can also see that the flowering time has an effect on the fitness of the plant. So in this case, how many of these fluffy seed heads they make basically dramatically decreases as plants flower later in this northern garden. So this affects basically where plants can still reproduce and also how many seeds they make. So it could have a direct impact on further spread as well. So knowing this, once I came to California, Ingrid and I were really interested in this question of basically how does this affect the distribution of this plant? Does it still have the same climate niche as before, or is it able to grow in different climates? So we started to do a niche modeling project, where we first asked, okay, so where is stinkwort present exactly in Europe? And then this range expansion, is that just a case of tracking their optimal climate conditions northward with climate change, or has they shifted their climate niche? Have they spread beyond this? And then finally, we wanted to see how would such a scenario change invasion risk assessments in California. So what is climate niche modeling? It comes with a lot of names. You might hear species distribution models or climate envelope models, habitat suitability models, but they all come down to the same idea. So you try to identify the preferred climate conditions of a species, which in this case we'll call its niche. And you do that by looking at where it's present and what the climate of that area is. So for example, you look at all these dots and you plot them in this climate space. In this case, it's temperature and precipitation. You see, okay, this is the optimal habitat. And you can use that to predict in space at other locations or in different time periods where you expect this plant to be present. So for example, in this plot on the right, they did this for some pine species where the green areas are expected to be newly available habitat with climate change, and the red areas are expected to become unsuitable in the future. So what did we do for stinkwort? We collected all these data points in California, thanks to CalFlora. That was very easy to do. Now in Eurasia, we had lots of different data sources. So these could be national databases, small papers, herbarium specimens, floras, and anything that I could get my hands on. And I also had to define the original native range boundary so I could see what was the baseline before they started spreading. So to do this, I got to dive into lots of old maps and overlay them and sketch out this boundary. So this is the final native range map where we are today. So the red line is the native range boundary historically. So we pitched it around 1930. And then all these dots you see here is where stinkwort is present in Europe now. And you can also see they follow a familiar roadway pattern. And they are now present all the way up to Poland and even southern Sweden. So the resolution of this model is quite coarse. So we had a grid of climate data that was 0.5 degree latitude and longitude. So that means about 35 by 35 miles. But that was quite useful at this sort of large scale that we're looking at here. So what did we find? So I'm going to walk you through this slowly. But here on the left, we see this climate space, which is described by these two axes, so 1 and 2. And here in the circle on the right, you can see what these axes mean. So on the x-axis, we go from, on the left, areas that have high seasonality in rainfall and a large difference between day and night temperature. So this is the situation that we have in California. And towards on the right, more temperate areas which have lots of rain in the summer, unlike in California. And if you go on the y-axis at the top, we have also more sort of colder seasonal places versus at the bottom, it would be the opposite. So here, what we see on this graph is in purple is the historic native niche of stinkwort before they started spreading. And then in blue, we see that indeed during this expansion, the niche expanded as well. So it moved sort of to the right and upward to these more temperate climates. And we think that might have to do with this evolution of earlier flowering time. So what does this look like on a map? So here we have a map of Europe with the original boundary in black and the results of a max end niche model. So the colors indicate habitat suitability, so the more blue it is, the better. So this is sort of our starting point, the historic native range and the climate of the past, where we would expect suitable habitat to be for the historic native stinkwort. Now what we can do is we can project this forward to the present climate. And if you sort of squint at this blue blob here, if I go back and forth, you see that indeed we would expect the plants to move north as the climate warmed over the past century. So they would be able to have more similar habitats northward. But what really happened was this. So these are the present occurrences overlaid on top. And they went well into the orange, so they went way beyond what we expected. So if we were to fit a model now to all of the present data points, then this is currently the suitable habitat for stinkwort in Europe. So basically extending way further north and east than before. And they are still actively spreading, and new records are coming every year. So it is quite possible that they will fill up this climate space. So did they simply track climate change? We don't think so. So what can we conclude so far from the native range is, okay, they expanded their niche northward, consistent with this earlier flowering, beyond expectations based on climate change, and road size were really important as well. Now, what does this mean for California? So here we have a similar plot as before, where now in brown you see the historic native niche, and in purple we see the area that has so far been occupied in California. So this is only sort of a small portion of this whole blob, although this is at the scale of all of North America, what could be suitable for stinkwort. So first thing you see is like, okay, it's only a small part, but you also see it's not outside of this brown area. So it's highly overlapping with the same habitat that's occupied in the native range. Now, if we look at the expanded native niche, it mostly expands on this end. So there's even more unsuitable habitat, suitable habitat still uncolonized. Sorry. But basically we see a high niche stability. So what does it look like on a map? So here we have different colors based on models based on different scenarios in the native range. So this blue color here, where all the dots are, is the climate space of the original historic native niche. And as you can see, all of these dots are still present in this area. And now this was done a few years ago, so there should be a few more dots up here now. But generally, basically, stinkwort is still confined to this historic native niche. Now, if we were to project the expanded niche in Europe, then these lighter blue areas would become suitable habitat. So if there were a similar niche shift in California as happened in Europe, then these might be new areas at risk of invasion. And now there's two other colors. This light blue area would still not be suitable, so that's basically really high mountains. And the gray area, we can't say because there's no equivalent climate present in Europe. Okay. So what else have we been doing at UC Santa Cruz is we want to further evaluate differences between plants from the native and exotic range and along these expansion fronts to see if anything else of interest might be evolving. So we have plants from all of these locations, similar places in Europe, and then from Santa Clara County and 4 invasion fronts in the Sierras. And we've been growing them in the greenhouse, measuring lots of traits. And Miranda has been doing her amazing work at Blue Oak that she told you about already. So stay tuned for more news in the future. We have sequenced all of these plants, so we're looking at the genetic level as well. But the main result I want to show you in light of this talk today is that we looked at flowering time again. And what we saw here was that the yellow line is the flowering time of the plants from southern France, so Mediterranean area in Europe. And the green lines are the plants in California. And they're basically doing exactly what the Mediterranean plants are doing. And they're not flowering at the time of the Dutch or the more central French, more temperate plants. So this all lines up with what we saw before, that they're still confined to this historic niche. So main takeaways, I would say that, okay, stinkwort is still actively spreading in California. They haven't filled all of the available habitat yet. And these early detection efforts are really important. If a similar niche expansion were to happen like it did in Europe, then some cooler, moisture areas are at risk of invasion. But the good news is we haven't seen any of this yet. And stinkwort is still confined to the historic niche. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening and all of the data sources that were available to us, and of course, the funders as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikki. We'll take a question from Zoom. No questions. Are there any questions in the room?
I feel like maybe I've seen another talk from yours, maybe you've looked at this, but seems like maybe the California introduction happened potentially before this evolutionary climate shift for early flowering. And, or it seems like maybe you could comment on what this might mean for preventing or, thinking about the importance of preventing additional introductions into California from Europe.
Yes, very good point. So yes, time-wise, it would have happened before this large-scale expansion. So yeah, we definitely do not want to be introducing any plants from Northern Europe that are now super good at growing in these different climates. In terms of what might happen in the future in California, it all depends on the genetic variation of the plants that were originally introduced. So even in southern France, we see that the majority of plants flower late, but there will always be a few that were early. So if those were present in California and they weren't lost, and then they might be favored eventually. But thankfully, we haven't seen that happen yet. And there seems to be very little variation in flowering time among the plants that we have sampled, at least. So that is good news.
We're going to go to Zoom next. Go ahead, Serena.
Yes. What kind of damage did you see in the native range from the pest? Is there a possibility of finding biological... Sorry, there's the second part of the question that just came. Is there a possibility of finding biological control agents?
Right. So first half damage, not really. So it's because it's a native range expansion, people are not terribly concerned about it. It's sort of like what many species are doing. They're moving northward. They don't get as massive, they don't get as abundant as you see in California. So because it's native range, there might be some other things that are still keeping it in control. As to what those are, I would refer everyone to Patrick Moran, who is working on that. And I'm quite excited to see that in the future.